Hello, my name is Ben Pink Dandelion, and this is the fourth of four films on the kind of history of Quaker theology. In this film, I want to talk about the 20th century. Now, the 20th century is interesting because we get both the consolidation of different traditions of Quakerism, of what we can now identify as a kind of conservative tradition that's largely Christocentric and unprogrammed, of what will become a liberal tradition, unprogrammed and theologically diverse. I'll say more about that in a moment. And of programmed, largely programmed tradition, and an evangelical tradition as part of that. In North America, we can find three distinct, four, in a sense, distinct groupings: Conservative Friends, Friends General Conference, who are an umbrella group for liberal yearly meetings; Friends United Meeting, which is really a continuation of the Orthodox tradition; and Evangelical Friends Church International, which comes out of a kind of renewal, a revival movement amongst Friends at the end of the 19th century and through the 20th century. So we can also find a whole variety of hybrid kinds of Quakers. We can find unprogrammed evangelical or semi-programmed evangelical, and some degree of programming amongst some liberal Friends as well. So it's a very complex global mix, but as I said in the last film, still with a number of aspects that are shared across those traditions. The belief in the centrality and basis of direct experience of the divine, a particular lifestyle of witness that comes out of that, and a desire to discern the will of God through a particular mode of discernment. So a number of things that are still held in common by Friends. So returning to Britain, where one theological tradition largely eclipsed another, we find evangelical Quakerism dominant by about 1835, but interestingly, and affecting major reforms in the way that Quakerism operated, particularly around marriage and dress and speech, and an increasing confidence about being a Quaker in the world. And we see that generally in Quakerism globally as we move towards the end of the 19th century. But it's that very freedom, that very opening up of Quakerism that will allow new ideas to come in, and in Britain will eclipse the authority of evangelical Quakerism. And in North America will shift Hicksite Quakerism into a liberal variant. The end of the 19th century is a time of biblical scholarship, higher criticism, that starts to dispute how and when the Bible was put together, to understand its multiple authorship, its pragmatic political construction. And for the sons and daughters of evangelical Friends, well, for Christians everywhere, this can present a major challenge, but for the sons and daughters of evangelical Friends, this is a problem they can bypass by returning to the beginning, the first understandings of early Quakers. That, in Fox's terms, this we knew experimentally. We know what is authentic through our spiritual experience. And if we place experience as primary, we can get around that difficulty of scriptural authority. And what we find in the 1880s and 1890s is a number of particularly younger Friends espousing a kind of a renewal of early Quakerism. So, experience is primary. Secondly, that faith should be relevant to the age. They don't necessarily want to go back to the uniform wearing of 18th century Quakerism, the Quaker grey, the broad-brimmed hats and the bonnets. They want to move with the times. They want, thirdly, a faith that's relevant to the age. They want to be part of civic society as well as an authentic spiritual group. They want to be involved. After 1871, Quakers in Britain can be full citizens, and they want to enjoy that citizenship. And fourthly, they adopt a kind of sense of a progressive revelation. It's actually technically called progressivism. That God will reveal more of God, of what God wants over time. And so a group of Quakers discerning faithfully in 1909 can necessarily be better informed than they ever could have been in 1809 because of God's unfolding revelation, a chronologically unfolding revelation. And so new revelation supersedes old revelation. There is a continuing revelation, but it has a chronological aspect to it. You put these four elements together: experience as primary, faith relevant to the age, continuing revelation, and progressivism, and you find a Quakerism that's not tied theologically to anything, to any text, or to any part even of its own tradition. And if we want to characterize liberal Quakerism in the 20th century, and this would include British Quakerism, parts of North America, Quakerism in Australia, New Zealand, parts of the rest of Europe, it would be as almost a ship that no longer needs to return to any harbor. As early as the 1930s, people are saying, well, if experience is primary, do Quakers need to be Christian necessarily? And certainly in London Yearly Meeting in the mid-60s, draft membership regulations are turned down as being too doctrinally Christian. And it's stated in Yearly Meeting, not all of us here use that language to describe our spirituality. We have a Quakerism on the move, and it's on the move in particular theologically. It becomes more plural theologically and more diverse. One of the ways we can understand this is not in terms of fragmentation, but rather that the glue that holds the Quaker movement together, that offers coherence, lies elsewhere, no longer in terms of doctrine or theology, but in terms of the way in which Quakers are Quaker, what we might call a behavioral creed rather than a belief one, an orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy. So the way Quakers worship, the way Quakers maintain the business method rooted in worship, the way Quakers are in Quaker time as Quakers together in meeting houses, those things are far more conservative in a sense. They're the aspects of conformity, of coherence within a liberal Quaker group, whilst belief becomes an increasingly private and personal matter, a belief story, a way in which each of us individually makes sense of our spiritual experience. So we go into the silence of worship. Ideally, we will have some kind of transforming experience, perhaps offer vocal ministry as a result of it, Have that heard in the silence as we drop back into that space. Have it feed the rest of our life, our ministry out in the world. But what sense we make of it, the detailed theology of where we are in relation to the divine, the light, the holy, and increasingly we see a list of terms, as Rhiannon Grant has showed in her work. What sense we make of that, what language we use, and it can change over time, becomes a personal matter. And so truth, once so vividly proclaimed by friends, that Quakers had the truth, they were the true church. Truth, with a smaller t, becomes provisional or personal or partial. Quakers are no longer saying that they are the true church or even part of the true church, but they are one faith group amongst all the options. One option amongst all the faith groups and none. Truth is no longer a single category, but is individualized. What this means is there's a kind of perhapsness or a towardsness around Quaker theology. There's that metaphor of the elephant in the darkened room, and someone has part of it and someone has another part of it, and together they might be able to work out what an elephant looks like, but no one of us has the whole story, or there are many paths up the mountain. And so we have a perhapsness about Quaker theologizing. In fact, we are sure in the liberal tradition that nobody has the complete truth or the final word. If anything, we're rather cautious about those kinds of certainties. So unlike people in other Christian groups who may leave out the words of creeds, who are uncertain about some of the certainties of their church, we could say that the liberal friends are certain about being at least a little bit uncertain. They're absolute in their perhapsness, dogmatic about their uncertainty. And this is a very distinctive theological position, what I've called an ortho credence, a way of holding a belief system that actually offers, I mean, in a sense, it's part of the behavioral creed. It's part of that way of being a Quaker. And the theological content is less crucial. So in the 1980s in Britain, there was a kind of a division between Universalist and Christocentric Quakers. Did you have to be a Christian to be a Quaker? Or was it true there were many paths up the mountain? And that eventually got sorted out into generally a Universalist perspective. What we find in the 1990s and the early 21st century then is another challenge from groups of friends who find the term God unhelpful or irrelevant, sometimes called non-theists, although that term is broader than that. It also includes people with humanists, for example. So, do you need to be religious? Do you need to hold a belief in God to be a Quaker? And in liberal yearly meetings, that question has largely been answered by saying, no, it's up to the individual. What actually creates greater tension is the degree of certainty with which people hold different theological positions. So there was a time where some Christian Quakers felt they were being eldered for their ministry, and where other non-theist friends felt excluded. It wasn't about the content of their theology, it was about the degree of dogmatism and zeal with which they held it. So there are two ways in which you can loosen your ties to the Quaker community in the liberal setting. The first would be to run into the meeting and say, I have theological truth. I have it for all people, for all time, and you need to listen to me. A little bit like George Fox. That would create a tension in a liberal Quaker setting in which the individual journey is strongly affirmed and promoted. The celebration of difference, of diversity, of a unity of diversity. The second way to loosen your ties would be to run in and say, I'm fed up with this form of Quakerism. I will sing while you have your worship. And of course, that would naturally lead to a tension, both with the conservative and conformist behavioral creed, but also because just logistically, it's not going to work very well. And of course, now that Quakers are one option amongst all faith groups and none, the meeting might just turn around and say, well, if you really like to sing, why not try the Methodists? You will be no worse off there. Each group has its own ministry, gifts, and blessings. And it is up for us to find the one that suits us. What this also means, this lack of monopoly on theological truth, is that Quakers may not need to try so hard to be accessible to everybody. No longer the true church for everyone, but for the self-selecting few who like the flavor of Quaker spirituality. And of course, there's always a danger there that we become a self-selecting group that closes its doors even inadvertently to different demographics and constituencies. So liberal Quakerism moves in a very particular direction. It becomes plural, diverse, moves away from the Christianity of the first liberal Quakers to be a much broader shop front, as it were, in the spiritual marketplace. And a broader shop front means that people join with different senses of connection. Buddhist Quakers, Muslim Quakers, Hindu Quakers, non-specific Quakers, non-theist Quakers, each finding something in the broad shop front. Peace, simplicity, truth, to which they are deeply attracted. The end of endogamy in 1859, the ability for Quakers to marry outside of the movement, will in time lead to the decline of dynastic Quakerism, of the family being the key unit of the Quaker meeting. What we see through the 20th century is a far greater percentage of Friends joining as adults. And in a recent survey of Britain Nearly meeting, it's nearly 90% of Quakers have come in as adults. That then brings challenges to education and being able to tell people about the Quaker tradition, about what it is to be a Quaker, how it is, of how to be a Quaker. And you know, that also leads to meetings taking on different theological flavors, and sometimes to just some plain misinformation and confusion out there in some Quaker meetings, where there isn't any kind of set introductory educational program. So, globally, Quakerism grows through the 20th century, grows both geographically and numerically. Mission work by evangelical Friends, particularly in East Africa and Central and Southern America, pay huge dividends numerically. And today, of 400,000 Quakers globally, we'll find 1/3 of them will be in East Africa, and probably maybe a fifth in Central and Southern America. So what we find then is that the dominance of the global north starting to wane. It's a slower process because the wealth and resources are still concentrated in those yearly meetings in Europe and North America. But numerically, Quakerism is much more vibrant elsewhere. And the percentage of Quakerism, globally the percentages are going to shift quite markedly, and have shifted quite markedly across the 20th century, from the numerical dominance of the global north to the numerical dominance of the global south. And we can expect reverse mission from those growing yearly meetings to the ailing yearly meetings and declining yearly meetings in the global north. Some attempts to revive the spirituality of yearly meetings that have really become very relaxed and worldly in their spiritual sensibilities. So the future is open, the future is bright. We can, as Quakers, be led in any direction. We can do anything that God leads us to do. And we have huge amounts of freedom through this sense of continuing revelation and chronological authority, whether or not it needs to be bounded by scriptural authorities in certain Quaker traditions or not. So Quakerism alive and well after 370 years, and with a very open, exciting future globally. I hope you found these films helpful. They haven't perhaps been as brief as I thought they might have been, but I hope you find them amusing. Thank you.